Hello there, and welcome to The Explainer. Sometimes when you look at the news, it feels like you're just staring at a chaotic mess of random events, right? Well, today, we're going to treat it like a giant global jigsaw puzzle. I promise you, by the time we're done here, we're going to connect some of the biggest headlines out there and find those hidden patterns that link them all together. Okay, you ready? Let's jump right in.
So, let me ask you this. What do a diplomatic summit, a hurricane, and a bunch of teenagers have in common? I know, it sounds like the setup for a really weird joke, doesn't it? But seriously, this is the big question for today. These things that seem totally unrelated, they're all crucial pieces of our puzzle. They represent power, nature, and humanity. And believe me, they are constantly bumping into each other in ways that shape our entire world. Just stick with me, and I guarantee the connection is going to be crystal clear by the end.
All right, to make sense of all this, we've got a roadmap. We've broken our journey down into 4 key sections. First up, we're going to look at global power plays. Think of it as a high-stakes chess game between world leaders. Then, we'll zoom right in on nations under pressure and see how those big moves create real turmoil on the ground. After that, it's time to take the world's economic pulse. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with humans, history, and heart. Because let's be honest, behind every single headline there are powerful human stories. So that's the plan. Let's get started.
Okay, Section 1. This is all about the grand strategies, the major moves happening on that global chessboard. We're talking about the big players, the powerful nations making decisions that ripple out across the entire planet. This is all about diplomacy, new alliances, and that delicate balance of power that can shift in the blink of an eye.
And our first big piece of the puzzle, well, it's a potential earthquake in the landscape of the war in Ukraine. There's been a really significant development, a fundamental change in how the United States is approaching peace talks with Russia. So let's pull this apart and see what it actually means.
So the key word here is alignment. For more than a year, the biggest roadblock to any kind of negotiation was the insistence from the US and Ukraine that there had to be a full ceasefire before any real talks could even begin. It was a non-starter. Well, that precondition, it's now off the table, at least from the US side. That one move completely changes the game because it brings Washington's starting point way closer to Moscow's. And on Russia's side, their demands are pretty clear. They want full political control over the Donbass regions, and they want to freeze the current front lines everywhere else. So this agreement to just start talking while the fighting continues, that is the massive shift that's opened the door here.
And the analysis of this situation shows you just how much the dynamic has changed. For months, the entire debate was about if these two sides should even be in the same room. Now, not only are they in the room, but Russia has already put its shopping list on the table. This quote frames it perfectly. This isn't a timeout to just pause the fighting. No, this is the beginning of a messy divorce settlement. And a lot of people are seeing this as a major diplomatic victory for Moscow because the whole conversation is now starting on terms that they find pretty favorable. Putin is there to make a deal, and you can be sure he expects to walk away with something.
But look, this high-stakes diplomatic dance isn't just happening over Ukraine. All across the world, every single move is being watched. From border talks that have been dragging on for decades to the totally unforeseen consequences of someone's personal vacation.
We are seeing this delicate tightrope walk everywhere. In Asia, you've got China and India gearing up for their 24th round of border talks. 24. This is a source of tension that has been simmering for decades, where progress is measured in, millimeters, not miles. And then over in Europe, a UK trade envoy just had to resign because he took a personal trip to northern Cyprus. And what's the big deal? Well, his vacation was seen as giving a nod of recognition to a breakaway state that his own government officially doesn't recognize. It just goes to show you, when you're a public figure, a simple holiday can blow up into a full-blown international incident.
So what's the real takeaway here? Well, as the quote says, the whole point of this diplomatic dance isn't to become best friends. It's just to manage these incredibly complicated rivalries without accidentally starting a crisis. The China-India talks are like this slow, methodical waltz. But the UK envoy situation, that's a perfect example of tripping over your own feet. It's a really sharp lesson that, in the world of diplomacy, there is no such thing as a personal trip when you go to disputed territory.
All right, let's pivot for our last stop in this section, the Indo-Pacific. Because over there, we are seeing this rapid acceleration of military partnerships. It's like a flurry of joint exercises and naval visits, and it is all happening in response to one big shared strategic concern.
So let's look at the facts on the ground. Or maybe I should say, on the water. Australia and the Philippines just kicked off their largest ever joint military drills. And get this, they're doing it in a town that directly faces the heavily disputed South China Sea. We're talking thousands of troops. At the same time, thousands of miles to the south, Japanese warships are making a very rare visit to New Zealand right after they conducted joint exercises. Look, these are not just routine training events. These are significant coordinated demonstrations of a growing military partnership.
And that really brings us to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? Why is this happening? Why this sudden explosion of military handholding all across the Pacific? Why are Australian troops training in the Philippines? And why are Japanese destroyers sailing all the way to New Zealand? Well, it all comes down to one shared strategic concern.
And this quote just nails the answer. The analysis is really clear. These exercises, these port calls, they are a direct response to China's growing military and political influence in the region. You don't conduct massive military drills on the edge of the South China Sea by accident. It's a very public statement of partnership, a super clear signal that a united front is forming. As the quote puts it, it's the diplomatic and military way of sending a loud, coordinated message that says, "We're watching you."
So now let's shift our focus. We're moving from that international chessboard down to the streets and communities within these nations. Because this is where those big power plays we just talked about, this is where they translate into real-world pressure. And that pressure can lead to conflict, protests, and political chaos. This section is all about what happens when those global and national tensions finally boil over.
So let's look at two places where public safety is really breaking down. First, in Soweto, South Africa, protests have erupted after an e-hailing driver was murdered. This is just the latest death in a violent, long-running turf war with the traditional taxi industry. And then in Guatemala, a prison riot broke out because the government decided to transfer some powerful gang leaders. And what happened? The inmates took 9 guards hostage. In both of these cases, you're seeing a breakdown of state control. One happening out on the streets, the other happening behind bars.
Okay, so what's the take? The violence in Soweto isn't just random. It's being described as a clash over economic survival. You've got these established informal power structures, the taxi operators, and they are fighting a desperate battle against new technology that threatens their entire livelihood. And the community, they're caught right in the middle. And in Guatemala, the analysis is just as direct. The decision to move those gang leaders wasn't some simple administrative task. No, it was like kicking a hornet's nest. The authorities knew it would provoke a violent reaction, which just tells you how much power these gangs actually have. They are basically running their own little states inside the state's prisons.
This pressure also shows up as political conflict. And here we've got 3 totally different flavors of it. First, a classic. A territorial dispute is flaring up between Peru and Colombia over a tiny little island in the Amazon. Second, in Bolivia, the political climate is getting really toxic, with the former president, Evo Morales, now facing public threats of arrest from his rivals. And third, in Burkina Faso, we're seeing this fascinating act of political reinvention. The country's coup leader, President Ibrahim Traoré, is being deliberately rebranded as a hero for the entire continent.
So, what's the deeper story here? Well, that Peru-Colombia dispute is being called a classic nationalist drama. It's a textbook tactic for leaders to distract from problems at home by whipping up patriotism over a tiny piece of land. In Bolivia, the threats against Morales are a throwback to a very familiar political playbook in that region, where you see the legal system get weaponized against your opponents. But honestly, the most interesting take here is from Burkina Faso. The rebranding of President Traoré from a military junta leader into a pan-African hero is being called a masterclass in political narrative building. It's such a powerful reminder that in today's world, controlling the story is every bit as important as controlling the state itself.
All right, time to switch gears and dive into the world of economics. You know the saying, money makes the world go round, but it can also make it grind to a screeching halt. In this section, we're going to take the financial temperature of the globe by looking at 2 countries facing very different but equally intense economic pressures, Nigeria and Argentina.
First up is Nigeria. And on the surface, there's a little glimmer of good news. The overall inflation rate has actually slowed down for the 4th month in a row.
Now, the technical term for this is disinflation, which it's a bit confusing. It doesn't mean prices are actually falling. It just means they're going up a little less quickly than they were before. But, and this is the really crucial part, food prices are still stubbornly high. And for the average person, the cost of groceries is the only economic indicator that really matters, right? So this little bit of statistical relief hasn't actually made it to the dinner table yet.
And this analogy just sums it up perfectly. Imagine the economy is a patient with a high fever. The good news is that the fever might be breaking. The trend is heading in the right direction, but the bad news is that the fever is still high enough to give a serious headache. An inflation rate of almost 22% is still incredibly painful. It hurts families trying to make ends meet, and it hurts businesses trying to plan for the future. It's a sign of potential progress, but the crisis is a long, long way from being over.
Okay, now let's head down to Argentina, a country that is experiencing some serious economic whiplash right now. We're looking at two headlines that seem to completely contradict each other, and it's a perfect example of the complicated, two-sided coin of Argentina's economy at this very moment.
This slide lays out the country's economic whiplash perfectly. On one side of the coin, you have a massive legal victory. A court in New York just hit pause on a $16.1 times billion-dollar judgment against the country. That is a huge sigh of relief. But on the other side of the coin, you have a total crisis of confidence at home. The cost for the government to borrow money in its own currency has skyrocketed to record highs. Why? Because investors are basically refusing to roll over the government's debt, which signals a profound lack of faith in the country's stability.
So how in the world do we make sense of this contradiction? Well, the analysis uses this brilliant, simple analogy. That legal win, that's like dodging one very, very big bullet. Great, but the debt situation at home shows a fundamental lack of trust. The market is acting like a skeptical friend. You know the type. You ask to borrow 20 bucks and they demand your car keys as collateral. When your friends start acting like that, it's a clear sign they don't trust you to pay them back. For Argentina, this signals deep, deep trust issues in its economic management, and that's a problem that no single court victory is ever going to solve.
All right, for our final section, we're zooming out from the politics and the economics to focus on the human element. Because at the end of the day, world events are not just abstract concepts on a screen. They're stories about people. They're about communities facing down enormous challenges, celebrating historic milestones, and remembering the people who left a lasting mark on our world.
160 miles per hour. I just want to let that number hang in the air for a second. That's faster than a Formula One car at top speed. It is a number that represents immense, almost unimaginable power. And right now, that power is churning away over the Atlantic Ocean.
That number is the wind speed of Hurricane Erin. It has gone through what scientists call explosive intensification to become a top-of-the-scale Category 5 storm. Right now, it is hammering islands in the Caribbean with catastrophic force, and the entire U.S. East Coast is on high alert, just bracing for what could be a devastating impact. This is a story about the raw, untamable power of nature.
And here is the really sobering take. The analysis connects this single weather event to a much larger and frankly pretty alarming global trend. The explosive growth of storms like Erin is being fueled by unusually warm ocean waters. So this isn't just some random freak storm. It is a direct consequence of a changing climate. The quote puts it bluntly, "This is what warm oceans do," and it serves as a brutal preview of the new normal, a future where storms this big, this powerful, may become a lot more common. But even in a world filled with storms and conflict, you find these incredible stories of hope, history, and legacy. Let's look at 3. In Wisconsin, a restaurant owner was suddenly hospitalized. Her entire staff, all 30 of them, all teenagers, banded together to keep the business running. Then in Australia, the nation is marking a historic 50th anniversary, the day the government officially returned land to the Gurindji people, a landmark moment in a fight for indigenous rights that has been going on for generations. And on a sadder note, Australia is also mourning the loss of Bob Simpson, a cricket legend who is credited with transforming the national team from chaos into champions.
And the take on each of these stories is just fantastic. Those teenagers in Wisconsin are proving they're capable of more than just TikToks. It's a story of unexpected responsibility and real community spirit. The Gurindji anniversary?
That's a powerful reminder that struggles for justice can and do yield historic results. It's a testament to decades and decades of perseverance against impossible odds. And finally, Bob Simpson is remembered not just as a great player, but as the tough-love coach who turned a rabble into world beaters. His legacy is one of leadership and transformation.
So we come all the way back to our jigsaw puzzle. We've seen how a diplomatic shift in Alaska connects to military drills in the Pacific. We've seen how economic pressure in Nigeria creates a kind of hardship that mirrors the turf wars happening in Soweto. And we've seen how a hurricane's fury can exist in the exact same world as the quiet heroism of a bunch of teenagers in a Wisconsin restaurant. The point is, none of these pieces exist in a vacuum. They are all interconnected. They're all threads in the same complex, messy, and sometimes beautiful global story.
Understanding these connections, well, that's what we try to do here every single day. So to keep piecing this puzzle together with us, make sure to follow us on Spotify and YouTube to get our updates every morning at 8 a.m. GMT. We'll be here to help you connect the dots.
And that brings us to the end. We've shown you the pieces of the puzzle and how they might fit together. But the story, it isn't finished. It's being written every single day by the actions of governments, the forces of nature, and the choices that ordinary people make. So I'm going to leave you with this one final thought. The world is a complex, connected story. What part will you play in it? Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.